Welcome to The Story. I'm Evan Watson, in for Pat Doris this week. 50 years ago this month, President Richard Nixon signed one of the country's landmark environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act. The goal? Identify species on the edge of extinction and work to keep them from disappearing. But 5 decades later, has the Endangered Species Act worked? Environmental reporter Cale Williams brings us a special 5-part series all this week, Endangered Northwest. For every listed endangered species, there are far-reaching implications that stretch well beyond the forests, rivers, and grasslands that these animals call home. Advocates say protections are necessary for preserving the diversity of life. Opponents say it's government overreach that damages economies and threatens the cultural identity of rural communities. This week, Cale will look at some of the most consequential endangered species here in the Northwest. On Thursday, he'll give us an overarching look at the Endangered Species Act itself. And on Friday, we'll share your thoughts and answer your questions. But we start tonight with the creature often at the center of conflict and controversy in the Pacific Northwest, the northern spotted owl.
The late 80s and early 90s were a tense time in the forests of the Pacific Northwest.
This is American National Forest! We yield no more! Earth first!
The controversies are very big. The trade-offs are very big.
For several years, conflict over the northern spotted owl had been building as the federal government weighed whether to provide protections for the bird. Timber towns feared the worst.
What's going to happen to Sweet Home?
What's going to happen to Sweet Home is going to die.
Their range extends from northern California to British Columbia, and they primarily feed on small mammals like mice, gophers, and tree voles.
Here he comes.
Spotted owls can grow to nearly 2 feet tall, and they usually have the same mate throughout their lives.
Oh, there she is.
Raising their young in tree cavities of forests hundreds of years old. And it's there, among the Northwest old growth, that pressure began building in the 80s to protect their rapidly diminishing habitat.
No cuts! No cuts!
Environmental advocates took to the woods,
If the logs move, we asphyxiate and die.
blocking roads and camping in trees to protest timber sales. Forestry workers rallied in small towns and big cities around the region, fearful for their jobs and their way of life.
That means I'll lose a business if they don't have the lumber industry anymore.
My dad is a forester, and my brother's a forester. My mom is a master woodland manager, and my family owns and manages about 400 acres in Oregon. So we know a lot about forestry and wildlife.
Today, Fran Cafferata is a wildlife biologist who consults for timber companies. But back then, she was a little girl, worried her father would lose his job.
You know, I just remember it being really a scary time.
BLM was nice enough to leave this little small patch of old growth.
At the same time, Doug Hyken was just starting his career as a lawyer with the environmental group that would go on to become Oregon Wild.
As a native Oregonian, I was a bit jaded about clear cuts, didn't think there was much I could do about it, but when I learned later that, we were driving species to extinction or near to extinction, and there was something we could do about it, it really changed my views.
Worked on forest issues, old growth timber harvest, spotted owls.
And Paul Henson, a wildlife biologist, was working out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office in Portland.
When I first came on, there were people climbing up trees and camping in the trees. In fact,
Henson, who would go on to become Oregon State Supervisor for the agency, didn't have to look far to see the conflict.
There was a guy who roped up and camped outside of our office window, 3 stories up above ground, to protest. And so it was very acrimonious, very passionate. People were chaining themselves to trees or to trucks. There was a lot of altercation, a lot of ill will, a lot of fighting.
The biggest threat facing spotted owls at the time?
The main original issue for the spotted owl's decline was habitat loss due to massive clear-cutting of the older forests in the Pacific Northwest.
Old-growth forests are some of the most complex ecosystems in the world, home to towering conifers, lush understories, and a vast array of wildlife, including the spotted owl.
It's got huge trees that are well over 200 years old. It has a variety of ages of trees, different sizes. different species. It has a diverse understory with deciduous shrubs that provide great habitat for birds.
After more than a century of aggressive logging, old-growth forests were disappearing quickly.
Imagine the state of Oregon with virtually no old-growth forests. That's the trajectory we're on in the 70s and 80s.
But those same forests also served as the main economic driver for many of the Northwest small towns, where mills were often the central hub of the community.
I used to ride my bike to the store, a little corner store with my best friend, and we would sit outside with our little Jolly Rancher candies, and we would talk about it. It was what was being talked about around the dinner table. My dad was in forestry, her dad drove a log truck, and I was so scared that my dad would lose his job. You know, he was the breadwinner for our family.
In 1990, after years of conflict, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service finally made a decision.
Good Friday morning, it's 8:30 in Sweet Home. This is KFIR News. I'm Cindy Riley reporting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made its expected announcement about listing the northern spotted owl as a threatened species this morning.
The designation as a threatened species meant the government had found that without a significant change to logging practices, the owl could face extinction. It was unwelcome news in timber communities where "Save a logger, eat an owl" was splashed across t-shirts and bumper stickers.
Why should the owl be protected 100% and a way of life not?
You bet I'm scared. There's a reason to be afraid. They're talking 28,000 jobs related. Well, that's a bunch of baloney. There's thousands more than that.
With the owl finally protected, the government still needed a plan for how to save it. In 1994, that came in the form of the Northwest Forest Plan. It set aside roughly 10 million acres of federal land, protecting old growth, encouraging younger forests to develop, and providing buffers near rivers and streams.
You know, during the Reagan years, the last of the big old forests on federal land were being liquidated. You're talking 200, 300, 400-year-old trees that, your kids and my kids, have as much legacy right to as anyone else, and not as 2x4s. The Northwest Forest Plan stopped that. It put the brakes on that.
But with all that land now mostly off limits to logging, some of Cafarata's fears came true.
It had a tremendous impact on the timber industry that was scary for me.
Between 1989 and 1995, timber harvest on federal land fell by roughly 90%. But there were also other issues at play. Mechanization meant that fewer timber workers were needed, and smaller mills were being shuttered in favor of fewer, larger operations.
There was a tremendous decline in housing starts and the price of timber was going down. So it's a complicated issue. The spotted owl got most of the blame because it was easy to blame them and it was undeserved. It definitely had an impact, but not as bad as a lot of the timber industry folks like to say.
But for Hyken and other environmental advocates, the Northwest Forest Plan was a game changer.
It's an ecosystem plan. It's not just a spotted owl plan. It's going to be good for spotted owls, for salmon, for marbled murrelets that live in the Coast Range, and for all the other species that live in our old-growth forest.
And that had always been the end goal, even when protesters were camping out in the forests in the late 1980s.
The owl has worked because laws protect species. There is no federal law that protects the forest. There ought to be.
After 30 years under the Northwest Forest Plan, you might think spotted owls would be thriving. But that has not been the case. At monitoring stations in Oregon, Washington, and California, federal researchers watched spotted owl populations continue to plummet between 1995 and 2017.
It would be the female.
In some places, by as much as 80%.
Yeah.
And much of that decline was because of the barred owl, a larger and more aggressive owl native to the East Coast that began showing up in the Northwest as early as the 1970s.
They are territorial species, and so they kind of bump each other out of these ideal habitats. And the spotted owl is just a little bit smaller, just a little bit less aggressive, and the barred owl is kind of the king of the roost and tends to, push the spotted owl into less ideal habitat.
Hyken says that as the spotted owl deals with this new threat, preserving habitat is more important than ever.
You have these territorial species that compete with each other for the same habitat, and for them to coexist, we need more habitat, not less. If your in-laws are going to move into your house, you don't want to make your house smaller, you need to make your house bigger.
Tensions around the spotted owl have cooled significantly since the heated days of the 1990s.
Yeah, I think that
Cafferata now works with timber companies to figure out ways to harvest trees with wildlife in mind.
So we want there to be young trees, we want there to be middle-aged trees, we want there to be older trees, we want there to be a mosaic. So we're really looking for ways that we can connect habitats and allow species to live out their life histories.
And she says it's a misconception that timber companies are only looking to clear-cut as much forest as possible.
We are stewards of the forest, we care for it, and we want it to be there for us, we want it to be there for future generations and for everybody's enjoyment.
For Heiken, he knows the fate of the spotted owl remains in doubt.
So success for this endeavor is going to be humans showing great restraint and not logging for 100 years. If we just slip up for a decade, we're going to lose a tremendous amount of valuable habitat.
But that hasn't made him any less resolute in his determination to protect it.
So when we are saving the spotted owl, we're not only saving a bird, but we're saving ourselves.
Cale Williams joins me now. And Cale, great story there. First, how many spotted owls are there? What are we looking at?
Well, that's a tough number to pin down because their populations continue to decline. They think that there are about 15,000 between Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, with about 3,000 of those on federal land here in Oregon.
Okay. So the barred owl being the biggest threat here, what are they doing about that?
Well, there was some big news about that. Just last month, the U.S. Forest Service proposed killing about 400,000 barred owls. These are the owls that obviously compete with the spotted owl, and so they need to, give them a fighting chance. And they have done some studies where they found that in areas where barred owls were removed, that the populations of spotted owls have stabilized. But I mean, you're talking about killing almost 500,000 barred owls here, and so it's a tough nut to swallow. But at the same time, that's about 1% of the total barred owl population. So it's not going to hurt their overall population. It will individually hurt those birds, though.
Interesting. I assume that'd be a big undertaking, getting to 400,000, that number, when it comes to it.
Yeah, I mean, they're planning to do this over 30 years, so it's not going to be something that they try to get done in a month or two.
Sure.
But yes, a big undertaking.
Great. And then what's coming up tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow we're going to take you out to Eastern Oregon, and we're going to talk about the gray wolf. As the spotted owl sort of faded as this political flashpoint, the gray wolf really kind of stepped in, and there's been a lot of conflict between ranchers who want to protect their livestock from wolves and wolf advocates who want to protect wolves from being killed after they go after livestock. So we'll be talking to a couple of those folks, and we'll be talking to another group of people who very rarely are mentioned in these conversations who played a crucial role in bringing the wolf back to the Northwest.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Cale Williams, for that report. And now it's your turn to chime in. What are your thoughts after seeing part 1 of Cale's series? Maybe you have a spotted owl memory of your own to share. You know the drill. Email the story at kgw.com or call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090. I know the story team usually ends the show on Monday with a Digging for Old segment, but hey, Pat's not here this week, so we're changing it up. All right, now, the real reason is that today's segment connects with Cale's story that you just saw, which included a short mention of this, the phrase, "Save a logger, eat an owl," on bumper stickers and shirts after the northern spotted owl was listed as threatened in 1990. Here's another example of that same theme that we found in the Oregon Historical Society's online collection, Spotted Owl Helper. Clearly a play on the ever-popular hamburger helper. The picture on the front is a little off-putting, the pasta dish mixed with pieces of owl, with a parody hamburger helper character dressed as a lumberjack with a chainsaw close at hand. This came out in 1992, and it's obviously just a joke, especially considering the company that made it was called Gag Foods Company, based in Colorado. But it shows another layer to the spotted owl controversy. A gag company thought there was enough money to be made in exploiting the conflict. They did write on the bottom of the box that proceeds from sales were donated to both Northwest timber workers and a national environmental organization. But who's to know if that actually happened? Perhaps the most surprising part of this item in the Historical Society's collection, it actually came with a little bit of dried pasta inside the box. I'm going to pass on some spotted owl helper this holiday season. Up next on The Story, it's a segment that many of you have been waiting for. Governor Kotek unveiled the 10 recommendations that came out of her downtown Portland task force. From drugs to police to taxes, there's a little bit of everything. We'll go down the list one by one when The Story returns. Now let's get to a story that is months in the making. Today, Governor Tina Kotek unveiled the 10 recommendations that emerged from her downtown Portland task force that she created over the summer. The big reveal happening during the Oregon Business Summit at the Moda Center.
So I'm like you. I raise an eyebrow at the idea of another task force being part of any real solution. But in August, when Dan and I convened a group charged with helping Portland and its comeback, we took a bet that if you put people in a room from different disciplines and life experiences to solve a shared problem, you can leave with concrete solutions. And I believe we've won that bet. We came up with 10 concrete action items focused on the next 6 months.
You can decide for yourself if the governor won that bet she mentioned, because you bet here on The Story, we're going to look at those 10 recommendations. And it's important to remember these are just that, recommendations. Nothing is set in stone, so to speak. Nothing is set in stone, so to speak. And many require action from government on the local level as well as the state legislature. Number 1. Declare a tri-county, tri-government fentanyl emergency, meaning the state, Multnomah County, and the city of Portland should declare a 90-day emergency and establish a, quote, command center downtown to coordinate a response to the fentanyl crisis. Next, ban the public use of controlled substances and reduce barriers to prosecuting drug delivery. This one falls on the legislature, calling for a ban on public drug use and upping penalties for people caught dealing. Number 3. Depends on the legislature banning public use. Ramp up existing infrastructure for effective and speedy implementation of a public use ban, which is aimed at boosting a Multnomah County addiction treatment program. And before we go any further, you might be wondering what a fentanyl emergency is, what it does, what it means. The governor was asked that question at a press conference this afternoon.
The value of doing an emergency order, whether it's the state, the city, or the county, but in this case, all three, is it allows us to focus existing resources. So an emergency order gives you flexibility to reassign staff, to reassign existing dollars that could be in a different program. Say, we need to do these things. Without an emergency order, you have to go through your regular processes. This creates an urgency. It allows us to bring those dollars and those staff together in addition to what's already happening. I very much envision a place where there are good things happening, but they need to be in the same room every single day, having a conversation both on the public health side and the public safety side, so we can see more progress on the central city streets.
So the top 3 related to drugs and fentanyl on streets. Now to more of those recommendations. Number 4, focus peer-delivered services and street outreach workers specifically on the central city. Pretty self-explanatory. Number 5, increase safe and accessible options for unsheltered people. The task force touts the county's investment of $3 million for daytime shelters next year, as well as the homeless plan that the city and county announced last week. Number 6, expand Central City's homeless shelter capacity, which is mostly being done already with Safe Rest Villages, as well as the mayor's mass encampment sites, one of which might open in the spring on the north side. Number 7, increase law enforcement response in the Central City. The task force wants the Portland Police and Oregon State Police partnership downtown to continue into 2024, as well as getting PPB to put more public safety support specialists downtown, plus more clean and safe officers. Number 8, this one is simple, clean up the city. The task force wants community mapping of downtown's biggest trouble spots when it comes to trash and debris and everything else, before asking organizations like Solve to work through a prioritized list. The governor will also ask the legislature for $20 million for ODOT, which will be used for trash and graffiti removal. Number 9, bring down the 2020-era fences and plywood. We know you've seen them. The task force wants the federal government with its own buildings, plus the city, the county, and downtown businesses to prioritize taking down fencing and plywood ahead of the 2024 Rose Festival. Make it look different to make it feel different. And finally, number 10, declare a moratorium on new taxes and offer targeted tax relief. The task force wants elected leaders to agree to a 3-year pause on new taxes and fees, as well as putting together a tax advisory group to look at ways to improve our taxing structure.
There are a lot of recommendations. But part of my job with me and co-chair Dan McMillan was to take all of the ideas, prioritize of what we can focus on in the first half of 2024. And that's what you see in the top 10 recommendations, from the fentanyl crisis declaration to the areas around livability, to the areas around that are recommendations and hopes for the 2024 legislative session. All of those things are focused on making progress in the Portland Central City, bringing people together and being aligned. One of the biggest things we heard out of the task force is there's a lot of good things happening, but nothing seems to be coordinated. Well, we're working on that. That's part of the reason for the emergency declaration. So the alignment and the amplification of this work is going to be critical for the next 6 months to show not only the state, but the nation that Portland is turning a corner, and we are focused on results to make this a place where people want to visit and live in, and that's part of the recovery we're focused on.
So there you have it. Here's my take on this. None of this is very surprising. Outside of perhaps the tax moratorium, which may raise eyebrows and still needs buy-in from local governments, it feels like what we've known and talked about time and again. And it is frustrating how many of the recommendations still rely on future action, buy-in from state and local lawmakers. How long until that happens? Will it happen? Or will it be another wishful list of to-dos? We will see. We don't have the time to go through every recommendation in complete detail, but if you'd like to do that, head to the website there at the bottom of your screen, portlandcentralcitytaskforce.com. And before or after you check out that website, let us know what you're thinking of the recommendations so far. Email the story at kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. We want to hear what you think so we can share what you think and work through this together. Keep it right here. We're back with a final word right after this. Back at it. It's the last week of the KGW Great Toy Drive. One of the easiest ways to help is to give online. Just go to ktw.com/toy and click Donate Cash. If you make a cash donation, we will shop for you. Or you can always do it the good old-fashioned way. Just drop off a new unwrapped toy at any IQ Credit Union, Fred Meyer, or local Toyota dealership. Help bring a little joy to local kids this holiday season. That's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching tonight. The good stuff is coming your way next. And be sure to tune in tomorrow for part 2 of Kale's Endangered Northwest series. That one focused on gray wolves. Same time, same place, tomorrow at 6:30. We'll see you then.